Welcome back everyone to another Downward Day. And today on the channel we're going to be doing something a little different, where I'm making this video as sort of an addendum to the latest main channel project, and that is of course my video on the movie Office Space. So I'm recording this in roughly the first week that it's been out, and I've been following along with the reception, and thus far it's been much better than I expected. Because I'll be honest, during the months and months that I was working on this project, I was getting a bit anxious at just how people were going to take it. This was certainly one of the most politically bold videos that I've ever attempted on the main channel. The whole thing presents a bunch of unorthodox theories which I'm sure many would find controversial. And honestly, so far, the message of the video has gone over much better than I initially anticipated. But funnily enough, it seems like the most controversial part of the video has nothing to do with the actual main idea focused around economics and labor. No, by far the most backlash I got on any part of that video had to do with the section on hunter-gatherers. The number one point of contention throughout the whole video that the comment section seemed to disagree with me on the most had to do with my assertion that hunter-gatherers did not live predominantly violent and miserable lives, and that in certain aspects, their lives were actually easier than what we have to experience today. And so I got a lot of comments saying that I'm wrong, that I don't know what I'm talking about, and look, I'm not in the business of trying to mislead people or be academically dishonest, so I wanted to take a moment with this video here on the Downward Diary to sort of defend my position. I want to make the case based on my own research as to how the lives of ancient humans probably weren't as bad as what most people think. And before we get into things here, I have to clarify that I'm not an anthropologist. I've never dug fossils in the field or gone out to live with uncontacted tribes in the wilderness. Most of what I'm about to say here has been absorbed from the works of various authors who have been far more involved in this field of study than I have personally. I'm not an expert in this matter, and I acknowledge that the theories I've subscribed to could very well be incorrect. The purpose of this video is not intended to be a factual database for specific scientific reference. This is very much my personal opinion on the matter and more so an overview of why I've been persuaded to have this opinion. But with that out of the way, I will say that when it comes to the research I put into the main channel videos, I do at least try to maintain a level of academic and journalistic integrity. I'm an independent creator, I'm not on anyone's payroll, and I don't have a political agenda that needs to be fulfilled by my content. Really, as far as I'm concerned, my only goal is for the audience to walk away from the video more informed than when they came in. Whenever I try to present a story on the main channel, I try to get it as accurate to the truth as I can. I'm not classically trained or educated in pretty much any of the topics I talk about, but using my own research and critical thinking, I try to put out a product that's as close to objective reality as I can get it. I choose to pursue the topics you see on the main channel and develop them into full-fledged videos because I find them interesting, and I think they offer the opportunity to provide the most insight to the audience. I enjoy making videos that sort of shake up the status quo of what most people tend to think about something. And the topic of hunter-gatherers is something that fit that description. I originally decided to investigate this topic several years ago during a time period when I was feeling particularly disillusioned with the state and direction of modern society. If you've been paying attention to my content for a while, you've probably noticed that this is a big prevailing theme on not just the main channel, but this channel as well. And this is a sentiment where, if you're a fan of this channel, I'm sure many of you have also experienced, where when you go out in the world and try to act as a functioning adult in modern society, it's just this subtle, nagging feeling that's difficult to articulate that something about the way we conduct ourselves in the modern day is just not right. And I believe that when a lot of people try to dive into this feeling further and really investigate why they feel this way, most of the time you end up with an unsatisfactory answer that doesn't really make sense. Or you have people dismiss you entirely and insist that nothing is wrong and that you're just being overly neurotic. And for me personally, I never really felt like I found what I was looking for until I started reading up about hunter-gatherers. So starting about 4 years ago, I read a series of books that totally changed the way that I thought about the world. These books in no particular order were Tribe by Sebastian Junger, Civilized to Death by Christopher Ryan, and Free to Learn by Peter Gray. And what all three of these books have in common is that they show hunter-gatherers in a positive light. They actually look towards hunter-gatherer tribes for guidance as to how we can improve our lives in the modern day. Now, before I read these books, I was like many people in being highly dismissive of the merits of our distant ancestors. Whenever the concept of ancient humans was brought up, my first thought would always be, big deal, who cares about a bunch of stupid cavemen who died out? They had their time and now it's our time, and there's probably a good reason why civilization replaced them. I didn't really think there was any insight to be gained from talking about hunter-gatherers. But then I read these books, and they ended up having a truly transformative effect on how I came to view the nature of humanity. They offered me a persuasive solution to this broad philosophical issue of what exactly are human beings supposed to be doing with our lives? In other words, how are people supposed to behave if no one was around to give them instructions? And then I began to see that when it comes to problems in the modern world, the nature of hunter-gatherers actually matters quite a bit. Because before we can address the problems of modern civilization, we must first attempt to find a baseline expectation for human behavior. Our emotions, instincts, and desires are all adapted to function within a specific environment. And ever since the invention of agriculture around 10,000 years ago, most of the people on Earth have been living in a very different environment than the one we evolved to be in. Biologically speaking, the transition from human beings into modern civilization was very quick. So quick, in fact, that it outpaced the speed of evolution. And the consequence of this is that we find ourselves today in a totally transformed world. Yet, genetically speaking, we're still roughly the same creature that we were 25,000 years ago when the expectations for human existence were completely different. So what we have today is this disparity between what our genes and our instincts prepare us for and what actually confronts us in the modern day. And it stands to reason that this disparity versus the natural order of things is responsible for a substantial amount of the human conflict that we see in modern times. When you start pushing people into a more and more unnatural environment, it makes sense that you're inevitably going to see more problems. And for much of history, the underlying problems of civilization were attributed to the inherent problems of human beings themselves. It was the natural state of man which was blamed as the source for all the problems in society. And the function of civilization was actually viewed as this grand salvation protecting people from the worst parts of their natural state of being. This is why during the 18th and 19th century, the process of colonizing various indigenous people from around the world was seen as this humane thing. It was the great wings of civilization liberating all these people from their savage, natural way of life. It was always framed as the Western world doing the rest of the world a favor. The conversation has always been that we saved them from themselves, and that colonized people should be grateful, even if it meant that their entire people and way of life got wiped off the face of the earth. It was just always assumed that no matter the situation, civilization was just a straight upgrade to what came before, that our man-made world was superior to the natural world in every way. But when the time came to actually go out and observe the uncivilized tribes of the world, what we saw in reality didn't quite match up with this dysfunctional freak show that we had in mind. So before we go any further, I feel like I have to define what I mean specifically when I refer to hunter-gatherers. To put it simply, hunter-gatherer refers to human beings who exclusively hunted and gathered their food supply. They lived in tribes of 150 or fewer people, and they had no fixed or permanent habitation. They were nomadic people who moved along with the flow of resources. They didn't really keep any personal or private property other than what they could physically carry with them on the move. This set of attributes basically describes how human beings behaved for the first 90% of their existence. You can look at it essentially as the default way of life that nature provided for us. When you're attempting to assess human beings specifically through the lens of nature, this is what you'd find. If you were born into pretty much the first 250,000 years of human existence, you would have been a hunter-gatherer. But then all of a sudden, based on factors likely related to the end of the last ice age, human behavior started rapidly transitioning to what we now know today as modern civilization. Certain populations from around the world stopped roaming around for food and they started planting crops and domesticating livestock. People started to remain in fixed settlements that eventually grew into cities with thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And it's at this point in human development where people can no longer be called hunter-gatherers. So I just wanted to make that distinction clear, where hunter-gatherers are categorically different than people who practice horticulture or agriculture. And I say this because there are indigenous groups from around the world who do practice primitive farming and herding livestock, and they often get lumped in with hunter-gatherers in scholarly debate. But it should be noted that hunter-gatherers are not farmers. It's an entirely different classification of people. And the standards of behavior in day-to-day life are totally different. So for this video, I have to reiterate that when I'm talking about hunter-gatherers, I'm referring specifically to foraging people who were predominantly nomadic. And the existence of hunter-gatherers basically serves to answer one fundamental question. Are human beings inherently violent and selfish, and if left on our own, without any centralized power structure, would we cease to function entirely? So I want to start off by addressing this idea that human beings are naturally violent. There's this prevailing notion in modern times that ancient humans lived exceedingly dangerous lives because they were constantly at risk of getting murdered by others. This belief that hunter-gatherers had some kind of insatiable bloodlust, and if left on their own accord, they would just automatically start killing anyone they encountered. And this is one of the main assumptions people use to justify why we need centralized systems of authority to tell us what to do. Because without them, everyone would just revert back to their supposedly natural state of murdering everyone in front of them. But when it comes to the real hunter-gatherers in reality, are they that excessively violent? Well, the archaeological record and existing tribes today do show sporadic cases of violence. As is the case with people living in the civilized world today, they are capable of getting pushed towards violent actions. I think some people who watch the main channel videos seem to believe that I believe that hunter-gatherers were incapable of violence, which is never a claim that I actually made. Although from the wording of some of the sections, I can understand how you might have been led to think that way. So yes, I'm well aware that violence does exist in hunter-gatherer societies. But are they excessively more violent than people living in the civilized world? I think you'd have a hard time proving that's the case. I think in general, when it comes to the hunter-gatherer tribes that are studied today, violence is uncommon, and it's certainly not the default choice for handling conflict. Like, when you really think about it, if hunter-gatherer tribes were so prone to violence, how would it even be possible for us to send so many people out there to actually study them? I mean, that's what many of these anthropologists do for a living. They go out and physically live among the people they're studying for extended periods of time as total strangers. If these people really were so hostile and aggressive towards outsiders, why would they even allow this to happen? How would we even be getting any of this data if these tribes instantaneously decided to kill anyone who didn't look like them? It doesn't make any sense. And this idea of hunter-gatherers being violent savages breaks down even further when you consider the group dynamics that are required for their continued survival. Human beings are not meant to exist as lone wolves. The primary advantage that human beings have over the rest of nature is that we get to communicate with each other and essentially team up to form a collective that's greater than the sum of its parts. Lately online, there's been this meme debate topic of who would win between 100 humans and one gorilla. And I think this problem actually illustrates the point of why human beings need to exist in a community, where individually we're much physically weaker than most other animals of similar size. But where human beings succeed is our ability to group up with each other and form a cohesive unit. That's pretty much what you'd have to do to defeat the gorilla, and that's basically how human beings managed to survive in the bare-bones wilderness for hundreds of thousands of years. We have to be able to work as a team. And you gotta imagine that would probably be pretty difficult if everyone was born with this latent instinct to just murder everyone around them. It really doesn't make sense that you'd be able to form any sort of unity if everyone was a murderer. And to add on to that you'd be living in a group of 150 people or less. If it was common for people to just wake up one day and kill someone, your entire population would be whittled down to nothing real quick. So this whole premise that hunter-gatherers were excessively violent really doesn't add up. There are people who try to dispute this claim by saying that, during the American frontier, weren't there a bunch of examples of Native American tribes acting violently? And you'll have to forgive me if I don't exactly believe that this is a fair representation of the default state of hunter-gatherers, considering how a great deal of our documentation of Native Americans came when we were actively at war with them. And this was by no means some low-stakes war fought over gold or oil. Pretty much all the Native Americans during this time period were fighting for their continued existence as a people. So with that being said, it makes at least a little bit of sense why some of them might have resorted to violence when faced with this situation. And it's worth noting as well that even when confronted with the total extinction of their people, many of the native tribes still surrendered peacefully. Whenever you hear someone bring up the excessive violence and barbarism of the Native American people, they're most likely just cherry-picking a handful of tribes out of thousands, usually the Plains Indians such as the Comanche and the Apache. So just as it would be absurd to apply the cultural customs of Serbian people to all Europeans, you can't look at the behavior of one or two specific tribes tied to a specific geographic region and apply it to the entire continent of people. The entire indigenous population of North America represents a wide swath of behavior and customs. They were not this uniform hive mind of people, and by the time of the American frontier, many of them were not even hunter-gatherers anymore. So this entire argument is kind of beside the point. When it comes to this debate, a lot of people like to presume that hunter-gatherers and Native Americans are interchangeable terms, when really there's a lot more nuance to the situation. By the time of European contact with the Americas, plenty of native groups had already started adopting the hallmarks of civilization. And while they lacked the specific technological prowess of the Europeans, they were still very much advancing in their own right. In fact, when the Spanish first arrived at what is now Mexico, the capital of the Aztec Empire was one of the biggest population centers in the world. So clearly by this point, the indigenous people of the Americas had already begun to develop hierarchy and permanent habitation in agriculture and basic economics, which would make their behavior and cultural values no longer transferable with hunter-gatherers. Many tribes still were, but plenty of others were still very much on the pathway towards modern civilization. And to compound matters even further, Native American culture was probably completely transformed before most colonists even had the chance to interact with them. And that was the result of diseases introduced by first contact with Europeans that wiped out probably 90% of the existing population of indigenous people in North America. So by the time of the actual American frontier, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that any of the tribes encountered would have been in a truly natural state. They had just experienced what was essentially an apocalyptic scenario where 9 out of 10 people got completely wiped out. It's actually plausible that these circumstances would have made it less likely to encounter a true hunter-gatherer tribe, because many of them would have lacked the population to withstand such a mass casualty event. And even if you consider the tribes with the much more violent documentation like the Comanche, they were only able to achieve this behavior after the introduction of horses from Europe. So with all that out of the way, it's safe to say that much of the historic documentation of Native Americans cannot be used as a reliable analog to assess the natural state of man. But with that said, I think it is awfully interesting to note that when Christopher Columbus encountered the indigenous people of the Americas for the first time, he essentially observed a totally peaceful and cooperative society, and actually went on to call them the greatest people in the world. But that's just a little detail that never seems to get discussed very much. I also wanted to touch on this argument that the fossil record provides definitive proof that hunter-gatherers were violent. When people bring this up, they're referring to several examples of excavated human skulls which show evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. And based on this, they assume that it automatically must have been the result of violent confrontation. In reality, there's a wide variety of circumstances that could explain why these head wounds appeared. They could be caused by a burial ritual for the sick and dying. It could have been from people who were incapacitated or suffering and forced to be euthanized. It could have been people who were punished in accordance with a rudimentary system of justice. After all, there are plenty of nations in the modern world that still inflict capital punishment. There's really no way to know for sure the specific context for why these wounds exist. So anyone claiming that this presents definitive proof for the inherent violence of man, they're presenting a fallacious argument. For what it's worth, the archaeological record also shows evidence of extensive trade networks which probably would have been pretty difficult to justify if mankind was especially prone to violence. Of course, relying solely on the fossil record to address any of these issues will always leave us with questions that are impossible to answer. That's why I'm of the opinion that the most valuable resource for actually studying hunter-gatherers is to look at the existing tribes on Earth today. There are people who will say it's a biased sample due to the influence of modern society. But when it comes to actually understanding primitive human behavior, this is pretty much the best insight that we got. As long as the tribes are not dependent on modern society in any way, I think it's reasonable to infer that their behavior would be at least similar to our ancient ancestors. There is another assumption among modern people that human beings must have been naturally territorial. This point is often used as justification for why primitive humans must have been violent. It's this idea of humans being prone to aggressively defending their territory. And I want to make a note here that when it comes to the concept of territorialism, I've seen people attempt to apply this concept in two completely separate ways to primitive humans, and neither of them makes sense. The first claim applies territorialism in a biological sense. They look at the instincts of other apex mammals such as bears and big cats and try to apply that to human beings. Where these animals are territorial on a fundamental level, they stick to a generally defined physical area and try to ward off other rivals who try to enter it. This type of instinctual behavior really doesn't seem to apply to humans on a biological level, and I think this should be evident based on how humans have no anatomical component to physically mark their territory. It's well known that cats will physically spray urine to mark the boundaries of their hunting grounds. Bears will make their presence known by rubbing their scent all over various tree stumps. Both of these animals, of course, have a powerful sense of smell and navigate extensively through scent. They're often aware of the presence of other rivals simply by smelling them from miles away. Humans, by comparison, have a much weaker sense of smell, and we tend to have a hard time telling if other people are around without physically seeing them. This would seem to indicate that human beings evolved to not really mind the presence of other people. If humans really did have this innate sense of physical territory, wouldn't you think we would have developed some sort of instinctual warning system to let us know if strangers were in the area long before we saw them? The fact that we don't have something like this indicates that we probably don't have the same level of territorialism that a bear or a tiger has. The other kind of territorialism that people try to project on hunter-gatherers is tied up with our modern sense of private property. And again, considering that hunter-gatherers were predominantly nomadic, they would have had no frame of reference for owning property. Such an idea would have been nonsensical to them. If you could comfortably sustain yourself simply by roaming around and foraging for food, what territory would even be worth defending, and for what reason? Almost all the resources that hunter-gatherers must have found valuable would have been widespread and abundant. Human beings are clearly very versatile creatures. They can adapt to a lot of different circumstances. It doesn't make sense that we'd evolve to require any sort of hyper-specific food source or mineral just to survive at a basic level. If you were a hunter-gatherer, it would seem highly unlikely that there would exist this specific resource that would be so vital and scarce to covet a specific parcel of land. They probably would have had no reason to care about stuff like the oil and poppy fields that we fight over in the modern day. This idea of fighting over a patch of land really only became a thing after we started creating physical stores of food as a result of agriculture. And this conventional thinking of being the exclusive owner of some arbitrarily defined geographic boundary on a map, it's really a concept that we invented in modern times. Another justification I see that hunter-gatherers must have been violent is this belief that they were constantly on the verge of starvation. It paints this picture that primitive humans must have spent all their days competing for the only morsel of food for miles. This is another idea that so many people in the modern world seem to believe that just doesn't match up with reality. In fact, there is very little evidence of a hunter-gatherer on record ever starving to death. And believe it or not, there are probably plenty of hunter-gatherer tribes today that have better food security than many people living in modern society. And that's because the average hunter-gatherer will pretty much have an encyclopedic knowledge of what plants and animals are edible in their specific region. They would have this information taught to them pretty much from birth, and the same body of knowledge would be reproduced and replicated for every successive generation. So this idea that primitive humans would have had this huge day-to-day struggle of trying to find food really just undermines their intelligence and competence. It implies that human beings somehow evolved to require more energy than what was sufficiently available in their environment, which just doesn't make any sense. Why would we have adapted to not fit the limitations of our environment? The fact that we're still here today indicates that our ancestors were probably doing something right. It's just this absurd contradiction to look at human beings, the most intelligent creature to ever exist on planet Earth, and to presume that we were somehow unable to find basic food. And I think the primary reason for this misconception comes from the various cases of starvation and famine in developing countries from around the world. And I think what many people fail to realize is that the transition to modern society is what caused most of the famine around the world. People look at something like the trope of starving children in Africa and presume that that's how people must have been living before civilization swooped in and saved everyone, when what really happened is that civilization pushed people away from their self-sufficient means of gathering food, and instead made them dependent on far more fragile systems of agriculture, where instead of having the built-in knowledge of 100 different edible plants and animals in your area, you would instead have to rely entirely on the success of 1 or 2 crops. And if there happens to be any sort of natural disaster or pest that targets the specific crop and kills off the harvest, that's where you actually start to see the scenario of millions of starving people. It has very little to do with any lack of individual ability. The problem is that we've moved to a system of food distribution that is far less resilient against random chaotic factors of nature. The truth is that when it comes to starvation, we and not hunter-gatherers are actually more susceptible to famine. And that's mostly due to how complex supply chains have replaced our capacity for self-sufficiency. There is another prevailing modern conception that hunter-gatherer tribes were prone to warfare. And this conversation is distinct from the general concept of violence because it concedes that hunter-gatherers would have had harmonious relationships within the tribe, but they would have conserved all their violent urges specifically for confronting other tribes. And again, there is certain archaeological and historic evidence of violent confrontations between tribes, but it's certainly not a common or widespread behavior. And due to the additional evidence of trade and intermarrying between tribes, it seems far more likely that hunter-gatherer relations were peaceful and diplomatic most of the time. When you consider the alternative, this idea that human beings were especially prone to warfare, it's difficult to imagine how we would have survived into the modern day. If deadly warfare was the default response to any sort of conflict between tribes, how would the human race have not become completely depopulated? In addition to dealing with disease and wild animals and other forces of nature, you would constantly have to sacrifice the most productive members of your society in prime-aged men to either attack others or defend yourself from getting attacked by others. And if a particular fight goes south and you suffer, say, a dozen casualties, you pretty much just lost 10% of your entire population. Able-bodied people who can now no longer help with your survival in any of the times when you're not at war. If you were living among them, why would you risk decimating your entire population when it would be far simpler and easier to just move the tribe somewhere else? Based on the evidence of human migration, it would seem that plenty of tribes were content with the easier option. It's probably a key factor in why hunter-gatherers ended up on every continent except Antarctica. The concept of warfare is just another one of these things that, since we deal with it so much in the modern world, we assume that human beings must have always been like this. But as is the case with many other things I've discussed, the rise of widespread warfare seems to coincide with the rise of agriculture and people moving into permanent settlements. It was at that point where it started to become much more persuasive to fight each other. Okay, so maybe hunter-gatherers weren't excessively violent or territorial or hostile or prone to starving to death, but surely life back then must have been brutal considering how everyone died in their 30s, right? And this is just one of those ideas that's so widely misunderstood that it probably deserves its own video in the future. But to put it simply, no, hunter-gatherers did not die of old age in their 30s. This whole argument comes down to a misunderstanding of statistics. Prehistoric humans dealt with a very high rate of infant and childhood mortality, and this was actually a significant problem up until the Industrial Revolution. So if you took any given population and 20% of the people in it died at age 0, you can see how that would pretty significantly bring down the average life expectancy. But for the members of that population who actually survived into being healthy adults, they would end up living well past the average, which has been skewed excessively downward. So if you happen to be an adult hunter-gatherer, you really wouldn't have much trouble living into your 60s and possibly even your 70s, which is really not far off from how long people live today with all of our modern medical marvels. So sorry to burst your bubble on this, but hunter-gatherers did not start turning gray and wrinkly at their 30th birthday. This notion is just a total fabrication of reality, and it's really shocking how many well-educated, intelligent people continue to believe this. Another lie that has been thoroughly disproven at this point is this idea that human beings are naturally selfish, where in the absence of any sort of political or religious hierarchy instructing us of how to act, we would all just revert back to our selfish, animalistic desires and the whole world would devolve into total anarchy. And again, this horrifically frightening idea doesn't really match what we observe out of real hunter-gatherer tribes in the real world. The vast majority of tribes in the world today resemble an egalitarian society, meaning that no one individual has any power or authority over any other individual. People do what they can with their own abilities to service the general well-being of the group. They don't do this because anyone is specifically telling them to. They do this because of a shared and mutual understanding that the survival of the group is required for the survival of the individual. It's for this reason that in hunter-gatherer tribes, selfish behavior is almost universally punished. Whenever someone acts selfishly, such as taking more food than their fair share, they're actively harming the welfare of everyone else and actively harming the survival of the overall group. It's been found that overwhelmingly, many of the vices we see in modern society, such as greed and dishonesty, are actively weeded out of people in hunter-gatherer tribes. So when it comes to this idea that human beings are just preordained to act selfishly, it appears far more likely that this behavior stems more so from our modern ideas of money, wealth, hierarchy, and property. So this next point is not so much an argument, but more so a stereotype. And that's how in most movies and TV shows that feature primitive humans, they're often portrayed as being dysfunctional and inept. And obviously when you're making a comedy cartoon show, you don't exactly have this strict responsibility to be exactly scientifically accurate. But I get the sense that this joke portrayal of our ancient ancestors has sort of seeped into the public consciousness for how they must have actually acted. I think many people got the impression from these shows that hunter-gatherers were truly dim-witted and clumsy in real life. And I think people like it so much because it reinforces this idea that modern people are so much smarter and so much more sophisticated than our ancient ancestors, when the truth is that hunter-gatherers likely had similar intelligence to the average person today. Now, this intelligence would have been specialized to handle the day-to-day problems of their own environment. They wouldn't actively think in terms of science or philosophical reasoning that we use today, but in terms of active, practical problem solving in their day-to-day lives. There's really no reason to believe that hunter-gatherers would have been mentally challenged. When it came to the specific feats of intelligence that were required for their day-to-day survival, they were probably highly competent. If you really think about it, the cost of stupidity back then would have been much more severe than it is today. There would have been a much smaller margin of error for being incompetent. If you think about your own life for a moment, you probably know someone who's pretty stupid, but they probably have no problem surviving in the modern world. If anything, modern civilization actually provides a safety net for those of us who are less intelligent. If you think about a time period when human existence was face to face with the raw forces of nature, you probably couldn't afford to be dysfunctional and inept. You have to imagine that people back then must have been pretty competent to basically persist that way for 200,000 years. This perceived lack of technological progress doesn't really mean anything when their existing behavior was already sufficient for a relatively comfortable survival. Again, this is just us applying our modern frame of reference to a totally different set of circumstances. People learn to adapt to their specific place and time. If you teleported a Wall Street banker out of his office and put him in the middle of the wilderness, he'd probably struggle to survive. So what's his problem? Is he just stupid? A caveman would be able to figure it out, so why can't he? Obviously, you can see that it's not a fair question, but we pretty much do the same thing to hunter-gatherers. So it's important to recognize that we can't just apply modern standards to prehistoric life and have it make sense. I saw a lot of people on the original video take umbrage to my claim that hunter-gatherers had a harmonious relationship with nature. I understand that I probably could have clarified this wording a bit better, because some people seem to think that I was claiming that hunter-gatherers were a bunch of hippie vegans holding hands under a rainbow. And for as much as that sounds like my personal ideal society, I understand that primitive humans obviously did not live like that. It's well documented that they were extremely effective at killing large animals. And even in our early development, the presence of human beings would contribute to significant changes in a local ecosystem. So when I say the word harmony, I don't mean it in the sense that human beings were explicitly friendly with all the other creatures in the natural world. What I mean is that hunter-gatherers tended to view themselves as part of a larger system. They didn't tend to view nature as this hostile, oppressive antagonist that must be conquered and subjugated. Most of them saw the natural world as something to be respected. They were grateful for what nature provided them. It's evident today that many tribes view the natural world as a deeply spiritual place. They look upon the wilderness as this great benevolent force. And while objectively speaking, some of their activity could still very well produce negative effects on the environment, they certainly wouldn't have viewed the natural world as cynically as we do today, where every animal and natural resource is just another interchangeable economic commodity. Hunter-gatherers would probably be quite disturbed with our modern practices of deforestation, factory farming, and dragging mile-long nets across the bottom of the ocean. There is nothing spiritual or reverent about how we treat the environment today. So when it comes to this regard, you'd better believe that they had a much more harmonious relationship with nature than us. This idea of nature as a hostile adversary that must be conquered or exploited is another modern phenomenon. People today have this prevailing assumption that life 20,000 years ago must have automatically been miserable. And again, this is another symptom of us applying our modern frame of reference to a totally different standard of living. When addressing this topic, we often imagine ourselves teleporting to prehistoric times and losing all the accoutrements of modern civilization. We imagine how much worse our lives would be with no internet, no electricity, no air conditioning, and no running water. Since most of us would probably find this notion to be miserable, we conclude that people living in a world without these things must also be miserable. But this ignores the fact that anyone born into these circumstances would have a totally different set of standards for what is normal. Anyone raised in a hunter-gatherer tribe from birth would see these circumstances as business as usual and not as a downgrade. The conditions that our ancient ancestors lived in would have been harsh, I won't dispute that, but they all would have been fully prepared and adapted for those conditions. Human beings are highly adaptable to the conditions around them. And when a difficult circumstance gets common and widespread enough in our everyday lives, we sort of just get used to them. Think about all the stuff that we consider normal today, such as widespread drug use, homelessness, and obesity. A hunter-gatherer would probably find these things to be appalling, and assume that anyone forced to live in these conditions must be miserable. And while most people in modern society are well aware that all these problems exist, for the most part they don't really affect our day-to-day mood. They're just parts of life that we've learned to expect. They're normal. And in the case of hunter-gatherers, increased chances of death, disease, and injury would have been normal to them, and the simple presence of these problems would not have made them miserable. While they had a much higher risk of death, they would have also adapted a much higher acceptance of death. And when it comes to modern research, hunter-gatherers today actually appear to be less miserable than people in modern civilization. They appear to suffer far lower rates of depression and mental illness. Out of everything I've said so far, this is probably going to be the hardest thing for people to accept. But it seems to be the case that our transition to modern civilization has made people more miserable and not the other way around. With all that said, I think it's important for me to reiterate what my actual argument is with all of this. I'm not saying that hunter-gatherers had this perfect existence, and that we should dismantle all modern technology and go back to living exactly as they did. Clearly, the train has left the station in that regard, and we now have to make the best of the modern world as we've constructed it. My point with all this is that humanity's transition to civilization was not this direct upgrade in quality of life as most people assume it is. In many aspects, it was very much a trade-off. We've had to sacrifice a lot of guarantees in life to get to where we are today. By living in modern society, we have undoubtedly gained much more relative safety and access to incredible technology. But at the same time, it's important to understand what we've lost. It's important to understand what the trade-off actually is. If you lived in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you would practically never experience loneliness. You'd be constantly surrounded by a community who supported you. You'd be able to trust everyone around you. You wouldn't wake up every day in fear of getting ripped off by sociopaths and liars. This behavior would be entirely weeded out of society. Your overall life would be much more simple. the world around you wouldn't be constantly changing all the time. You wouldn't have to constantly worry about your job getting replaced by some unforeseen force in the next 10 years. And speaking of jobs, if you lived in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you'd probably have a much clearer purpose on what to do in life. And you'd be able to spend significantly less time working. It would have been much easier to be useful and contribute to the people around you in some meaningful way. You'd be taught everything you need to know for survival. You would never have to engage in any pointless labor. You would never be in debt. You'd have no authority figures bossing you around. Everyone around you would be of equal status, and you'd probably have no struggle in finding a romantic partner and having children. These are all qualities of life that would have been practically guaranteed in a hunter-gatherer tribe, and the very same qualities that many of us struggle to find in the modern world. So again, I'm not trying to claim that hunter-gatherers explicitly had it better than us. This is a qualitative assessment that can only be answered on a personal level based on what you value out of these things. That's really what all this comes down to. I'm sure that many of you, even after hearing all this, would still prefer to live in modern society by a wide margin. However, I don't doubt that there are certain people out there who probably would be happier had they been born into a hunter-gatherer tribe. I guess there is one part of this whole conversation that confuses me. It's just that when you bring up this idea that our ancient ancestors weren't a bunch of violent psychopaths who died at age 30, a bunch of people out there get really bitter and defensive about it for some reason. And this has always struck me as odd, because wouldn't you consider it good news that the inherent nature of man is somewhat pleasant? We've all heard of the inconvenient truth. Well, this is the convenient truth. Human beings are not repugnant. We're capable of some sense of virtue even in our most primal state. And yet, for some reason, plenty of people out there will almost act offended when you bring this up. It's almost like they want it to be the case that the natural state of man is inherently wicked, that you're not supposed to trust anyone around you because everyone is just one bad day away from reverting back to a dangerous, violent freak. And in my mind, this has got to be just such an exhausting way to view the rest of the world. Wouldn't you rather have the peace of mind that human beings are naturally decent creatures rather than being in a constant state of paranoia that anyone around you is a threat to your survival? And when it comes to this point, I can't help but wonder how many people have been manipulated into thinking this way. I'm starting to believe that all this rhetoric designed to dismiss and ridicule hunter-gatherers is the result of powerful institutions who need to justify their own existence. As we all know, fear is a powerful form of control, and I think that a lot of authoritarianism in the world today is justified by making us fear the natural state of man, where we've developed this sort of axiomatic belief that civilization is necessary to rescue us from our natural behavior. And we end up convincing ourselves that it is better to suffer under corrupt institutions than for those institutions to not exist at all. They make us believe that there is simply no other alternative for how we're supposed to live, where not only is there an alternative, but that said alternative was a stable and functional way of life that represented how human beings lived for 90% of their existence. And it's tragic to consider how there's probably so many people these days who are atomized and isolated from the rest of society because they bought into this idea that human beings are inherently dangerous and not to be trusted. That without a bunch of powerful political and religious institutions keeping us in line, we'd all just devolve into being a bunch of brutal savages. And I think at the end of the day, that's just a very foul and bleak outlook to have on other people. So that pretty much covers all I have to say about this topic. And even if you still disagree with me on most of my arguments, I hope that I've at least proven to you that this was not some frivolous thing that I researched for 2 seconds and put in the main channel video. I have dedicated a great deal of thought and research into this matter. And for as much as I would have liked to expand on it more in the main channel video, obviously you can tell that there would have been quite a lot to get through in a segment that I really wanted to keep brief and concise. So if you're still watching at this point, I'm glad you stuck around. I know that this is a very different style of video than what I usually do on this channel, so I hope that you still managed to enjoy it. So with all that out of the way, I'll catch you guys on the next one, and hopefully, you can learn to live more like a caveman.